I remember in Central Oregon, just struggling in ministry. And I went down to the river and just sat there. You got the white noise of the river, and I'm praying, just pouring my heart out. And I need a sign, Lord. Are you there? Like, are you still calling me to ministry? Is this what I'm supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
I'm lonely. I don't think I'm doing what I need to be doing. And there, this bird landed on a rock right next to me.
Well, hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining us for the very first episode of the Imperfect Pastor podcast. I am here with my brother from another mother. His name is Nate Hellman. Say hi, Nate.
Hi, everybody.
There's Nate. Exactly. My name is Chad Reisig, and I am a pastor in Salem, Oregon. I have the pleasure of serving as a lead pastor here. And we have sat down to create this podcast because, well, we realized a couple things. Number one is we both have a lot of pastoral experience between us, and we're not perfect at it.
That's right.
In fact, there's been a lot of bumps along the road, and we'll be happy to share some of those stories because some of them, honestly, are just flat out hilarious.
Exactly, yeah.
But it's the funny ones that sometimes you learn the most from.
That's true.
But we've also gained wisdom along the way that we would like to be able to share on this podcast because we realize that we have lots of coworkers, co-laborers in Christ, whatever you want to call yourself in ministry, who probably face the same concept, the same thing, which is you feel imperfect. And sometimes you feel like maybe you're just kind of making it up as you go and you're hitting roadblocks and you're getting frustrated. And this podcast is to serve as two things. Number one is to let you know you're not alone.
That's right.
And number two, our goal and our hope is to give some wisdom and perhaps enhance some skill sets that you might have to be able to do the calling that God has placed on your heart at a level that perhaps you never thought that you could. Nate and I approach this from completely different viewpoints, of course, because I grew up in the business world and Nate, you did not.
That's right.
How did you get into this?
Yeah, so I kind of accepted the call to ministry. It was way back in 2003, 2004, and went through an educational process of undergrad theology, and then got a little bit of pastoral experience just outside of that, and then about a year, and then went off to seminary to get my MDiv, and then, of course, with that, there's the practical, there's also the very theological, heady work that had to kind of detox from when I came back into ministry. And then, I've been working in ministry since, after seminary, since 2011. In various church contexts. I've worked in church districts, I've been the solo pastor of churches. Now I find myself in an interesting place because I have the amazing privilege of being able to coach and support pastors in our territory. And one of the things that I say whenever I go to a church, and this is like in all seriousness, I never want to stop being a disciple and teacher of Jesus. Like that's the whole aim.
Oh yeah.
Whatever God calls. And I hope and I think that that's kind of the call for every Christian, really, to fundamentally be a disciple of Jesus and teach him, make him known.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my MO, my passion. My passion is discipleship. But I come from, an educational process and then a few years of ministry experience.
So you went like the more traditional route. I came into it way different.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Right. So I ran from maybe God's calling on my life for a long time. And it turns out that I was pretty good at being a businessman. And I actually went the route of serving as a business executive in different industries. I started out in aerospace, if you can believe that. I'm like, dude, I'm so bad at math. I'm like, luckily I wasn't designing planes. Like I was running the business side of things, right? So I started doing that, moved into doing administrative work for local governments and managerial stuff like that, budgeting, all the boring stuff, right? But it turns out that I was really good at writing and research and putting stuff together and making sense of it. Went on to do that for about 20 years, managing people, managing organizations, working through budgets, but really kind of cutting my teeth and learning what it was to be a business leader. But then something crazy happened. Like I thought I was at the pinnacle of my career. I had the corner office. I was making really good money. I had a lot of employees. I had multi-million-dollar budgets. Yeah. And suddenly God calls me out of that and says, hey, I need you to come and work for the church now. I'm calling you to be a pastor. And I would like to say that it was a really hard decision to make, but at that point in my life, I had totally recommitted. I reconnected with Jesus, and it was like, yeah, okay, sure, I'll do that. And so I approached it not with the traditional route, which was I had all this business acumen, like organizational leadership skill set and everything, all the wisdom that came with that. But I'm like, I didn't have the theological background that you got through theology program and through your MDiv and everything else. I'm like, what's it mean to do exegesis? Like that's a huge word.
What does that even mean?
And then people throw around these crazy like seminary level words like soteriology or eschatology. And I'm like looking stuff up in a dictionary trying to figure out what it all meant.
Sure.
And so when Nate and I started talking about like a collaboration on helping pastors feel more secure and feeling a little bit more like they understood what their calling and their job function was even, we realized real fast that it was like we were two pieces that fit together really well because we approached ministry from two very different worldviews.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that, and boy, hearing your background now, like I don't think I mean maybe you've shared that with me, but I just forgot about all that. But I feel like I respect you. I respect you even more than I did. Like the bar has been set, and I'm just in awe of your experience and your wisdom. I mean, you're just
it's the gray hair. It's really what does it. That's
the thing. I respect my elders. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, there's like a little bit of an age difference between us, but at the same time, we're in middle age. Like we're both middle age. Yeah. Don't want to call this like the middle age pastor podcast, but it's the very much imperfect pastor podcast.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we want to talk about on our episode, we're gonna kind of strategize how we do the episodes. Like we've come out with a season 1 and how we want to approach it. But number one, what we have found in talking to colleagues and doing a ton of research, both of us, by the way, are total research nerds.
And I do embrace data and see the value of it. Like there's a lot of anecdote that comes in. You know, when we're defending maybe a position or we're making an argument, sometimes people will default to stories.
Yeah.
And I value that too. And I value opinion, but like you also have to get the 10,000 foot view and look at what's going on. So what is that thing that we're looking at today when it comes to the 10,000 foot view on pastors and what they're going through?
Yeah, we're looking at the really hard reality of the fact that we are all imperfect.
Yeah.
And sometimes that causes chaos in our life and in our calling and can create, the Barna Group calls an epidemic of loneliness, especially among clergy. That sometimes we feel lonely and we feel very helpless and we feel like we're doing everything wrong or we're trying so hard and we're just frustrated because the results aren't coming up. In other words, pastoring, I will tell you, having been a business executive for over 20 years and pastoring now for almost that amount, pastoring is so much harder.
Yes.
Than being a business person. Because sometimes you just feel like you're out on an island. You rep an organization and you rep a denomination, if the case is it may be, but it just oftentimes feels like you're just kind of like flying solo.
Yeah. On top of that, I would say, Chad, that we live in a time that's different than any other time in history.
Oh yeah.
I mean, of course, there's nothing new under the sun. But when you think about technology, when you think about how people communicate, when you think about the demands of the culture that we live in and how the church intersects and can effectively minister to the world that we're living in, we're in a different place.
Yeah.
And I absolutely, like in seriousness, respect our elders.
Yeah.
There's a wisdom there. And we're also in a completely different in a completely different context when it comes to the time that we're living in. On top of that, you have the location that you're living in, and then what we also bring to the table based on our own experience. And the challenge is connecting with this loneliness thing. It seems like if we're feeling like we're not measuring up, if we're not doing all the right things, if we're not checking all the right boxes, it's so easy to default to playing church, playing ministry, acting like we maybe have it all together, when inside we're lonely, pretending like we've like it's all together, and yet authenticity is going down, and loneliness really gets magnified in that kind of space.
Yeah.
The demands of the reality that we live in, plus the expectations that our church has, our those who oversee us have, our families, even the expectations that we have of ourselves, maybe the incongruency that we see when it comes to life and ministry compared to what we find in Scripture.
Yeah.
That can send us into a spiral and help us feel out of place, it leads to us feeling very lonely and isolated. And if we don't have people to confide in, and if we don't realize that there are people that are dealing with the same stuff, we can be in a very dangerous even place.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, the whole idea of it almost feels like you're playing a role sometimes. Yeah. It's like I'm playing the role of pastor. So I'm going to do everything that is expected of a pastor, and I'm just going to act like I know what I'm doing. And in the process of doing that, it just feels like we're fake. We're not authentic. We can't confide in others. We're just out there kind of floating.
Right.
The whole concept of fake it till you make it. Well, when's the point when you make it?
Exactly. This reminds me a lot of like my first year or two out of seminary, where it's like, okay, I've never been a pastor in charge of a church where I'm just the one guy.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I fell into a place of being a people pleaser.
Yep.
Of like, there are all sorts of different competing expectations. And so I better make sure that I'm doing this and doing that and doing this. And what really kind of changed my mindset was I had two churches and we had a blizzard. And we shut down one church because of the blizzard, and we left the other one open. And I had people complaining to me who were at the one church that was closed down that we closed down the church.
Yeah.
And people complaining to me at the church that we left open because we left the church open.
Yeah.
And I was like, can't
win.
I can't make everybody happy.
Yeah.
I guess that's a little bit different than loneliness, but I guess it does add to the element of stress and dealing with the expectations that are on our plate, and trying to perform.
Yeah.
When maybe we're really, really struggling, and we don't always have people to confide in as pastors, because we're on that pedestal. We're expected to be leading and having it all together. When is it okay to say that we don't always have it all together?
We don't always have it. Well, and you touched on it.
Often?
So, I mean, just think about the expectations that people, we're not talking about the Bible, we're not talking about things that God has commanded, but the expectations that people put on a pastor. I was going through the list in my head the other day, just like, man, so when I was in the business world, working a 60 to 80 hour week was normal. And then there were times when it was going to be over 100, 120 hours a week, depending on what time of year it was. And that was nuts. And I started adding up, if I did everything that all of my congregants thought that I should be doing during the week, how many hours would that be? Well, I'm like, okay, so they want me to be, number one, an expert preacher, which requires a ton of research, a ton of prep, multiple manuscripts, many hours to practice it, and then being able to condense it to a format that's about 30 or 35 minutes or so long. And then you add the expectations on top of that, because you have people that are like, but I want it to be relatable and story driven. And you have others that want it to be doctrinal and completely, deep theological exegesis. And then you have other people that are like, but it should also speak to those that have never, understood Christianity and they step foot in the church for the first time.
Apologetic.
Right.
Yeah.
But it should also speak to the people that have been in the church for 60 plus years and they already know all of this stuff. Why are you telling me again?
And I want to make sure that I laugh, and I want to make sure that I cry, and I want to make sure that there's data, and I want to make sure that there's story. All of these, and that's just preaching. So if you think about it, it's like you're looking at probably 20 plus hours a week just for sermon prep if you're trying to meet everybody's expectations. And that's not for your own personal edification. That's not your own devotional reading. That's sitting down at a laptop with a bunch of commentaries and whatever software you've got, just trying to craft a sermon that's going to speak to everybody. And in my church, we have about 200 people. And if I were to ask all 200 of them what their expectation is from a sermon, I'm going to get 200 different opinions. And that's just the hat of preaching.
Then they want you to be a counselor. I don't know about you, but I had one class in seminary on counseling, and it was very basic. And essentially, the teacher was like this: if you find somebody that needs counseling, send them to a counselor.
Yeah.
But I have church members that reach out to me all the time. Hey, I'm dealing with depression or anxiety, or I need help in my marriage and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that if you're qualified in those areas, you shouldn't lend help, but also realizing too that we are not mental health experts.
Right. We're often the first stop,
We're the first stop.
but and I do want to say, like, we do need to refer.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
amen to,
we
like,
will get to that in a future episode.
Yes. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Absolutely. But so they want you to be an expert counselor. They want you to visit every church member every week, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to spend at least an hour with each one of them, and it's going to be a glorious time where you can pray and listen to their stories, and they can get to know you and all of these things. They want you to visit every single person that has a doctor's appointment or is in the hospital, and their mom's favorite son's former roommate who's going through things. You need to go visit them as well. So there's another 30 or 40 hours a week just doing visitation for the expectation of visitation. Nothing wrong with visitation, but the expectation is you got to make a ton of rounds throughout the week.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have all of that. And then you're the board chair, you're the finance guru, you're the PowerPoint guy, the pro presenter guy, the easy worship guy, the sound system guy, the guy that has to open and close the church, mow the lawn, take care of the paint, the wall on the paint that's peeling, change the light bulbs, and everything else, the expectations that people heap on you. They're like, well, you're the professional. We hired you to do all of this stuff. You could easily spend 80 to 90 to 100 hours a week just trying to meet the needs that people place upon you, the expectations they place upon you, and you still won't do it.
Yeah. I'm stressed just by you rattling off that list.
And that's not even the whole list.
No, it's not.
That was my shower list, right? Yeah. It's like, wow, that's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. But we are going to get into, also in another episode, we're going to get into just the subject of boundaries.
Yes.
And how to navigate
and
all
how
of
to
that.
prioritize and all of that. So yes, absolutely.
But all that to say, like, that contributes to the loneliness, because we might be thinking, I need to be measuring up. I need to be performing in a certain way, and I'm not, because I'm dealing with all these expectations. And, how do you deal with that? How do you process all of that? How do you say no?
Yeah.
How do you.
Yeah, exactly. But through all of these, I will say this. If you have experienced loneliness in your profession as a pastor or in ministry in general, stress, you feel like you're going to burn out and you feel like you're faking it, I got to tell you, you're not weird. You're normal. This is something that every single pastor goes through in life. This is a single thing that pastors go through in a regular basis. In fact, there was a study not too long ago from Barna said this. So this is prior to COVID, right? COVID did a number on pastoral ministry. Let me tell you, I landed at my new church in 2020 in the thick of COVID. I do not recommend taking on a new church in the middle of a pandemic, let me tell you. So I can totally feel this stat. So the Barna Research Group did a 2015 study and said, how often do you pastor, these are Protestant pastors, feel lonely or isolated or like nobody understands you or gets you? In 2015, the number was 42% of pastors either felt frequently or sometimes, which is semi-frequently, isolated and lonely and like nobody understood them. 42%. That's a big number to begin with. I'm like, okay, almost half of all pastors prior to COVID dealing with that. Now let's fast forward to 2022, a year after COVID.
Okay.
So this is a much younger workforce. A lot of pastors retired before 2022. COVID allowed a lot of pastors to retire before 2022. And so they redid the exact same study. So now we have a lot of maybe younger pastors, newer pastors to the calling, things like that. It's a crazy stat. So 47% said they oftentimes feel lonely, isolated, or that nobody understands them. 18% on top of that say that they frequently feel that way. For me, I would interpret that as like almost daily, that they feel isolated and lonely and misunderstood. So for a grand total of 65%, 2/3 of pastors at some point in their life go through a valley where they feel lonely and isolated and that people just don't get them. And they're wrestling with this.
Wow. Yeah.
So when we say that, hey, you're not weird, you're not alone, you are going through what every single pastor has gone through at some point in their career. And according to that stat, a lot of us go through it on a very regular basis.
Yeah.
I mean, have you ever questioned whether or not you should actually be a pastor? I mean, Nate, have you gone through something like that?
Oh yeah. During COVID, for sure. Like that was a
everybody,
time. Yeah. Along with everybody else,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was a time of, great, a great amount of, there was a lot of adaptiveness that was required. Like you needed to be adaptive to what was happening, and there were feelings like I don't know what I need to do. I don't know what the next step is. We were all on our heels because we were responding to the pandemic. But yeah, definitely wrestled with it there. I wrestled with it early in ministry, in that first context that I talked about earlier, where I was people pleasing and it was overwhelming.
Yeah.
We go to those spaces when, I think when we don't have anybody in our lives that we can confide in.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about spouse. Our spouses are, praise God for
pastoral spouses.
Yes. But we also need colleagues. We need people who really understand what it is to be a pastor. And I don't want to dump on my wife, all the stuff that I'm going through.
No, that's horrible.
It is.
Yeah.
Right. But like those feelings of loneliness, like I'm hearing you say with this data that these statistics are reflecting those who are regularly feeling this.
Yeah.
On an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
We have seasons like that, which is perfectly normal in ministry, but to remain in that state, it's no wonder that there's so many people who leave the ministry, and I'm not faulting pastors for leaving the ministry.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of factors that contribute to that. The reality of feeling loneliness in ministry, there's ebb and flow when it comes to that in ministry for sure. Where I'm feeling more connected, where I'm feeling like, okay, I'm in the groove, I'm doing what I need to do as a pastor, and seasons where, I'm not feeling so good about life in ministry.
Yeah. And maybe you who are listening to this podcast or watching it online, you're in that season right now where you are one of the 2/3 of pastors that are feeling like you are lonely and you are isolated and nobody gets you. I want to tell you, number one, that is one of the top reasons, if not the top reason, why we felt like we needed to develop this podcast, because we want you to understand there are people out there that get you.
Yes.
And through stories, through wisdom, and through what we're able to share, we hope that you can understand that we all go through that.
Yeah, you're not alone.
You are not alone. I've had several times where I'm just like, dude, I could totally just go back to the business world right now. I could put in my resume, I can go find a job and not have to deal with the stuff that a church can throw at me.
Yep.
And I was reminded, I was talking to somebody the other day and I was having a really, really low moment. I don't even remember what the context was, but I was sitting in my church office and I had my head down on my desk and I was just weeping. I was overwhelmed. I was done. My feelings had been hurt. I didn't feel like I was worthy to be a pastor. I thought that maybe it was a temporary calling on my life and now it's time to go do something else. And I just felt stuck. Yeah. Like all of my efforts were for naught. Everything that I was doing wasn't working right. I was misunderstood. I was being, people were being critical of me. All the stuff that we deal with as pastors. So I'm just sitting there with my head down. And this is why I want people to understand that there are people out there that get you. I had a retired pastor who was my head elder at the time. And I got my head down and I'm just praying to God. I'm like, God, if you want me to keep going on this route, I need you to send me a sign.
Wow.
And it was the most miraculous moment in life because as soon as I prayed that prayer, there was a knock on my office door and I'm like, okay, my eyes are swollen. I got tears running down my cheeks. I'm like, this is the perfect moment to answer my door. Right. And so I answer my door and my head elder is standing there. He doesn't say a word. He just goes and starts walking. And I'm like, oh, great. Here we go again. Somebody else has said something and now they all want to come and confront me together. And I'm thinking total negativity at this moment. I'm lost in my loneliness and my angst. And he walks me outside and he still doesn't say a word and he points up to the sky and I look at the sky and there's this gorgeous double rainbow.
Wow.
And I looked up and I looked at the retired pastor and he just patted me on the shoulder and he said, never forget that God's got you. And he just turned and walked away.
Wow.
And I'm like, I'm just sitting there staring at the rainbow. I'm like, seriously? You just did that?
Wow.
And
That is so good.
yeah.
That is so
Right,
good.
right. And so, number one, Pastor, if you're listening to this right now and you're in that valley, I want you to know, Nate wants you to know that you serve a God that's so much bigger than the negativity that can swirl around a pastor, that can blast through the loneliness and the anxiety and the isolation that we face, because God is always with us, and he's going to lead you out of that valley.
It's interesting in our when we're lonely and struggling in our heart of hearts, it's like we're praying that same prayer that Jesus prayed on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
But just the reminder that he is there, on top of the reminder that you're not alone, but he is there, is huge.
Never abandons us.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a value to this subject, but you sharing the testimony of the rainbow, the double rainbow, reminded me of how in those seasons in ministry, in those dark seasons, I've had multiple times where I have revisited just the concept of my calling. Like, is this is this even what I'm supposed to be doing?
Yep.
And I go and I retreat and I pray. And there have been multiple times, I don't always encourage this, but there have been multiple times where I've prayed for a sign.
Yeah.
And at multiple landmark moments in my ministry, God has given me the sign of a bird. And it's just the reminder of, just as he cares for the sparrow, he'll care for me, he'll care for you.
Yeah.
I remember in Central Oregon, just struggling in ministry. And I went down to the river and just sat there. You got the white noise of the river, and I'm praying, just pouring my heart out. And I need a sign, Lord. Are you there? Like, are you still calling me to ministry? Is this what I'm supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
I'm lonely. I don't think I'm doing what I need to be doing. And there this bird landed on a rock right next to me and started like eating at some seeds or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh yeah, okay.
He sent you a bird so you weren't lonely.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So such a powerful reminder that we do have each other, but we also have God who calls us into ministry and is, he's promised, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. But it's we lose sight of that. Understandably. It's part of life when we're in the thick of loneliness and darkness. And we can't see him in the midst of all that.
Yeah. So here's a couple things we want you to know as we begin to wrap this first episode. Number one, there is absolute hope. If you find yourself in the valley now or in the future, or if you've been there in the past, there is hope. You're not alone. Mm-hmm. So in future episodes, we're going to unpack a couple of things. Number one is how to avoid hopefully going into the valley so often. Because sometimes we are the reason why we end up in the valley, is because we're trying to, as you've already said, people please, or we're trying to overcome frustrations that we have or others have with us. I think ultimately what it boils down to is, what we're going to really unpack is, let's get back to what the biblical model of pastoring is. Because when we step outside of the biblical model of pastoring, oftentimes we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble. And it's not instantaneous, but when it hits, it is super frustrating.
Well, and sometimes our training, sometimes our local church culture contributes to that. Like, oh, we're ministering in a different sphere, in a different space than what Jesus has called us to.
Yeah.
As pastors.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's good.
And we're going to talk a lot about that in future episodes. We're going to unpack what it means to follow that lead that God has given us on what it means to be a pastor, especially here in the 21st century. Mm. So we're going to help each other and learn with each other how to develop practices which honor God and refine our calling, both in our pastoral world and also in our home life for many of us as well.
That's so good. And I think that we just need to be reminded, like, hey, let's come down to earth. We're all people. We're all people in process. And we're just, as pastors, we're called.
Yeah.
We're called by God.
Yep.
And what that means is that we are continually needing to grow, continually needing to adapt, to meet what Jesus calls us to, and to meet the demands of a different context that we're in this day and age. And so it's like, what about this thought? Like, we're not the experts here.
No.
We're practitioners.
Yes.
And we hope that somehow the listener would be encouraged by what we're sharing, by our ramblings, by the jokes, maybe some memes on the social media outlets.
You got to do the memes. I mean, come on. Yeah.
But all to say, we're imperfect.
Yeah.
But somehow, in spite of ourselves, God uses us.
Isn't that the greatest truth that's out there? That there's the old saying that many of us perhaps have heard, that God doesn't call the qualified; He qualifies the called.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter if you're a pastor of a mega church that has tens of thousands of people that come to your services every weekend, or you've got a small community church that have 10 to 15 people in it.
Yeah.
We all go through the same stuff as pastors.
Right.
And we all have those seasons of loneliness and hopelessness and all of that. And we have to realize that A, that's normal, and B, that God's got us and He's going to pull us through it.
Yeah.
So we've covered the fact that loneliness is something that all of us deal with. Frustrations, loneliness, being misunderstood. And so we definitely want to dive into those in the next few episodes. What have we got coming up next, Nate?
Yeah, next couple episodes. One, we're going to be talking about how we overcome frustration in ministry.
Yeah. Nice.
And then we also want to look at, how do I revitalize my calling? What does it look like to have a strong ministry in the context of our own calling? So those are going to be the next two things that we hone in on in our podcast. And we'd love to hear from you when it comes to maybe a story of how God has helped lead you out of the valley of loneliness. If you could share that with us, we'd love to share that with our listeners as well. Share your stories with us at podcast@imperfectpastor.org.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to read those. We'll read everything that you guys send us, and then maybe we can even feature a couple on the podcast here in future episodes. Hey, Nate, before we close this out, let's let our listeners know that we actually have some resources available to them if they want to dig deeper on this topic.
Yes.
So we have a brand new website in addition to our social media pages, imperfectpastor.org. That's imperfectpastor.org. If you go onto that site and go to the podcast page, you will find the different episodes of the podcast that have been released, and you can click on resources, and it'll give you a list of all of the resources that we have been using for our own information, our own edification as we put together these different episodes, whether they be books, whether they be websites or articles or things like that. So head on over to imperfectpastor.org, click on the podcast page, and there'll be some resources linked out for you guys to check out if you want to dig deeper on this topic today.
Hey, if this podcast has been imperfectly helpful to you, we would appreciate a 5-star review wherever you're listening to this podcast. Thanks so much. God bless. I'm Nate.
I'm Chad.
And this is
the
Imperfect Pastor.
Imperfectpastor.org. Wait, what? Oh, wait. The Imperfect Pastor podcast. There we go.